Thank you for joining us for another recorded web briefing hosted by the National Archives and Records Administration. This presentation was on Wednesday, May 14th, 2014. Jack Cabral of the Permanent Records Capture Team will discuss how to withdraw your permanent federal records from an FRC and your agency's responsibilities. Let's join the briefing.
Jack Cabral graduated from Rutgers University with a master's in library science. He worked as an archivist processing congressional papers and university collections. He started a records management program at a large municipality in New Jersey, building the program from the ground up. Eventually, he moved to Massachusetts and is currently working as an archive specialist for the National Archives and Records Administration, and he specializes in permanent records retrieval and working for the Permanent Records Capture Team. With all that said, I'd like to pass it over to Mr. Jack Cabral.
Thank you very much, Paul. I appreciate that, and I did write that. Hello, everybody. We're going to get right into the briefing. Just going to go over a few agendas and housekeeping things for today. But the briefing that we're giving today is withdrawing permanent federal records from an FRC, your responsibility. Should be a fun briefing. So on today's agenda, we have the briefing hopefully will only last between 30 and 40 minutes with a Q&A to follow. This briefing is for individuals who have transferred or have a basic familiarity with the transferring process of federal records into the Federal Records Center. And then we're going to go briefly into who we are, why we're here, some key terms, and have a few scenarios will be presented to you, real-life examples of basically people just like all of us that maybe at one point were responsible for sending records or retiring records or transferring records into a Federal Records Center or an archives, the National Archives. So we try to give scenarios that really can tap into that experience that we all have had. And also, finally, a note, just if you can take a note of the slide number and save all questions to the end of the briefing, if you can, and then we'll answer a lot of the questions at the end, because the information that we give kind of builds upon, each slide pretty much builds upon the next. So some of your questions may be answered by the end of the briefing, and we'll be more than happy to answer any questions that you have to the best of our ability, and if we can't, we will find the answer for you. Okay? A little about who we are. Well, we're a team within agency services of the National Archives section that resolves permanent record issues. Our email address is permanentrecords@nara.gov. You can see it right there, and it will be spread throughout the briefing today. So if you have any questions about permanent records that you would like to ask or anything about this briefing, please feel free to send an email to that email address. In the heading, put briefing down so at least we'll know where it's coming from and what the topic is. Some of the projects that we have been involved in and continue to be involved in are creating briefings such as this one to be delivered to agencies that may not be aware of the various issues surrounding permanent records, identifying legacy schedules that are not in ERA. That's what our group does as well. It's the Permanent Record Capture Team. If I haven't mentioned that, I think I have, right? It's PRC, Permanent Record Capture Team. And we do really everything that we do involves permanent records. So working on the Presidential Directive 2.2, you might know about that, be familiar with that information, and we will hopefully be giving a briefing sometime later in the year on that one as well. And we have given briefings in the past on that. We work with the annual move, accessioning permanent records into the FRC, or from the FRC to the archives. And we also are creating a permanent records web page presence on archives.gov, among many other projects that we're doing within our team. Okay, and I think this slide here, and the reason why we kept it in here, this is a NARA mission statement, because I think in some ways this should be the mantra for everyone who deals with records in the federal government. And I'm going to read it here, and it is why we are here today. Because public access to government records strengthens democracy by allowing Americans to claim their rights of citizenship, hold their government accountable, and understand their history so they can participate more effectively in their government. And I think that says it all. So when we're talking about withdrawing permanent records, we have to understand that these are the types of records that have been identified through your record schedule as being these type of historic documents. So when you do withdraw those permanent records from a federal record center, these are the records that we're trying to get back into the National Archives and to preserve. So this is a good takeaway for you to understand why we are here today. And we understand that records management is not popular. Many times when you're sitting in your agencies, you get thrusted upon this type of extra duty gets thrusted upon you when you're sitting in your office. But really, you're looking at a higher cause here. You're looking at permanent records as being these kind of records that can hold our government accountable and are for researchers. So that being said, think about it in a different way, even though it is maybe an extra duty record management. But it does have a higher cause here. And we're going to have flowcharts throughout this presentation, and this is a basic flowchart that shows permanent records held at your agency, as you can see here. And into an FRC, Agency Record Center or Commercial Record Center, and that would be here. So this is the flow of permanent records that we're looking at for the sake of this presentation. And then on to the National Archives. We will be building upon this flowchart as the briefing continues, as I just said. During the course of this briefing, three terms I really wanted to clarify here are NARA, FRC, and the National Archives or Archives. NARA is a general term for our agency, right? NARA, National Archives and Records Administration. The FRC is, of course, the Federal Records Center, and that holds both temporary and permanent records. And then the National Archives, as you can see here on the right, sometimes I'll refer to it as archives, and that holds permanent records. And that only holds permanent records, where the Federal Records Center can hold both temporary and permanent records. And when they are in the Federal Records Center, remember, and I will mention this once again, as we go on a few times probably, that in the Federal Records Center, those records are legally your records. When they go into the National Archives, the legality of those records turns over to the National Archives. Okay. Let's move on to slide 6. And some simplified basic definitions before we really get into this presentation. And I know most of you probably at this level understand the difference between temporary and permanent records, but we want to say it here because we want to differentiate between the records and temporary and permanent withdrawals, which is coming on the next slide. So there are two types of federal records drawn from agency record schedules or record control schedules, as we like to say, and the general record schedule, and they are temporary records, and they are in the legal custody of you, remember that, the agency, and permanent records, once moved to the National Archives, are now in the legal custody of NARA. And today's confusing terms, temporary withdrawal loan and permanent withdrawal, as you can see here on the slide. Okay, temporary withdrawal from an FRC of temporary records. Temporary withdrawal, most reference requests, formerly the OF11, are for temporary withdrawals of agency records. Temporary withdrawals are returned after the agency's use to the Record Center for refiling in the FRC. So temporary withdrawal from FRC are for records that will be going back into the Federal Record Center. A permanent withdrawal from an FRC, a permanent withdrawal are removed, permanent records are removed and retained by the agency. Right? The agency may only return permanently withdrawn whole boxes from an accession of multiple boxes by submitting a new SF-135. And we'll be reiterating this many times, and if you have questions about it, if we haven't quite satisfied your answers by the end of today's briefing, we'll be more than happy to answer questions about that. So these records must be submitted in new boxes with a new transfer number. So that's the basic difference between a temporary withdrawal and a permanent withdrawal. All right, today's single concern, though, that being said, with all those definitions, permanent withdrawal from an FRC of your agency's permanent records. We are the permanent record capture team. So in this briefing, we are concerned with permanent records and permanent withdrawals of those records. Why? Because as we saw in the previous graph, those records should be going to an archive, the National Archives, according to the record schedule. So that's the main topic for today, folks. Okay, so and here's that wonderful graph, and I did get some kudos from my team on creating this graph. So I hope everybody likes it. So this would be a temporary withdrawal of records. Okay, permanent records from your agency to the FRC. Temporary withdrawal to your agency back to the FRC, or if the records control schedule says so, as a direct offer to the National Archives. The annual move, as you can see down here, okay, the annual move shifts the permanent records from the FRC to the National Archives when the record control schedule directs them to. And we'll be getting into the difference between the annual move and a direct offer. Okay, but both, suffice to say, both lead to permanent records into the National Archives. And a permanent withdrawal, these are graphs based on the information we had previously given here too. So this is not new information, just a graph form of what we were talking about. So a permanent withdrawal basically is the same process as a temporary withdrawal, except that the permanent withdrawal is a separation from the FRC, and often are never sent back to NARA. So that's our concern, is often the records that are pulled as a permanent withdrawal by the agency out of the Federal Record Center never find their way back to NARA. And that's not saying that all the records don't. We're not saying that. But what we're trying to say is that sometimes, or many times, those records do not end up back in to the archives themselves. And use the feedback tool on the left. Sometimes I get mixed up with the feedback box to the left, so I'm using feedback tool on the left. So just respond A, B, C, or D if you can. How many people in attendance have withdrawn permanent records from an FRC? A, never have. I don't know, not sure. B, C, yes, I have permanently withdrawn at least one box or folder. And D, I'm a pro at permanently withdrawing records with 5 or more instances. Okay. And then I'm going to follow up with a couple of other questions in the chat box, if you can. And this is for people who have withdrawn permanent records. If you have you sent them back to NARA? Okay, meaning the FRC, or as a direct offer to the archives. So if you can respond in the chat box, if you have withdrawn permanent records from an FRC, have you sent them back to NARA, meaning the Federal Record Center, or as a direct offer to the archives? And if you can just say what type of records maybe that you were dealing with, if you don't mind. And if that's the case, we might want to also have a conversation about that. But actually, at the end, you might even give us some pointers if you have time to stick around at the very end of today's briefing to give pointers to people who never have, to the 23 people who responded by never having done a permanent withdrawal. So maybe some lessons learned, or have some input on some of the lessons learned that we don't go over today. Okay, they turned out to be temporary records and were misscheduled. Okay, yeah, that happens, right? Yes, delivered to NARA regulations, standards, and guidelines. Okay, very interesting. And by all means, please, if you have withdrawn permanent records, just give us an idea of how many and maybe what type of records. All right. In some instances, she assumed close actually opened up again. Yeah, sometimes that'll happen. I mean, you kind of have to have an idea of what you want to do with those records in temporary withdrawal or a permanent withdrawal. And some of those best practices we'll be going through in a few minutes. But we're going to give a real-life example here in slide number 12 if people aren't able to actually see our presentation followed by the slides. This is slide 12, a real-life example number 1. We have 2 examples today for you to go over. The Bureau of Public Recreation, which is fictitious Bureau, BPR, transfers to the Federal Records Center 100 boxes of permanent records. The following year, it does a permanent withdrawal of boxes 26 through 30 from that transfer. BPR's original transfer is now listed in ARCIS as having 95 boxes as the actual volume. With those 5 boxes listed as being permanently withdrawn, as requested, the FRC returns boxes 26 and 30 to BPR. So, I mean, when we give these examples, what I want you to start thinking about is thinking about what could go wrong. What are some things that could go on? Because when we go through this briefing, we're going to be giving you a lot of examples of things that may go wrong and things that may happen, and even maybe at the end you can share some of them. But just to get an idea of the process here. Okay, and this continued, the same example. The following year, BPR does a permanent withdrawal of boxes 43 through 49 from that same FRC transfer. The original transfer now has an actual volume of 88. The original box list remains in box 1 of last year's BPR's transfer, but is no longer accurate. So my question here for you, okay, will be, and I hope everybody likes this graphic because I do, what is the one thing your agency should do to the records remaining in the FRC? Can you point out the one thing that you should be able to do in your agency to the remaining records in the FRC? Just respond in the chat box to the left, given that example. And the clue is, if you look at that last slide, slide 13, at the very last bullet point, what does it say? Yes, update our local records regarding what is actually stored in their accessions. Yep. And also updating the box list. Very good. Yes. Those are excellent. Update your inventory. The agency should send a new list to FRC. Yes. Prepare a new box list. Right. Excellent. Everybody's getting it. And that's it. And it's not all that you can do. And we're going to be going over other examples of what else you can do. And I like the inventory, and I like the updating the location. I think those are all great ideas. But the very least you can do is update that box list or folder list. Right? Awesome. Very good, everybody. Update the local list and box list and submit updated list to FRC. Very good. If and then, this is a slide that I think gets to asking a few questions of, if this happens, then you can do this in your responsibility. If you need to temporarily remove permanent records from an FRC, then fill out a temporary loan of records in ARCIS or in OF11 if your Federal Records Center still accepts that. And you can find those forms and that information on the FRC website, archives.gov/FRC. Your agency has a continuing business need for these permanent records. You hear that a lot. We have a continuing business need. And speak to your agency's record officer, who will contact NARA's appraisal archivist about rescheduling these particular records. Remember, if you hold on to these records over a year, you have to inform the National Archives that you are doing so in writing. And also remember that you are responsible for these records, because if you have any type of damage, you have any type of FOIA request or e-discovery type of request, then you are responsible for those records. Okay, and third, if you are curious, so you run an ARCIS query on permanent withdrawals to your office of your agency's records. So you search your office, then you would search your office for previous permanent withdrawals, find out what the history of it is. ARCIS will probably provide you with a history. I believe they can do that now. Send them back as new transfers to the FRC with new box lists, or do a direct offer to the National Archives. So real-life example number 2, BPR permanently withdraws 2 boxes of permanent case files from a transfer of 10 boxes. They add to those 2 boxes some records from the same case that they found in an abandoned file cabinet. They also add some new related documents that were created after the case was closed. The records now fill 3 boxes. They want to return the now 3 boxes to the FRC. What must the agency do? Okay, I typically would have asked these questions to you, but and they would have come each one at a time and bullet points. But the 4 things that you would do here in this scenario is send as new transfer to the FRC, right? So with an accurate date range for the records. Also, be sure to include a new accurate folder list for this new FRC transfer. Ask the FRC, okay, and it's good to have a working relationship with your Federal Records Center. They're actually pretty good folks, and they really like to help you when you have questions about transferring their records. So don't be afraid to contact your FRC and ask them any questions that you may have. Even if you aren't sure if you want to do a temporary or permanent withdrawal, ask them. They're actually very friendly and very helpful. So that would be something you do. Ask the FRC to annotate the original SF-135 to reflect any changes in the date range of the materials in the remaining 8 boxes. And finally, send the FRC an updated folder list with the original transfer from which those 2 boxes were withdrawn. So include in that transfer an updated box list. Or as I like to call it, a folder list, because if they're permanent records, remember, you should have a detailed folder list of the permanent records, not just a box list with listings of records. It should be a little bit more detailed than that, because you have to think about those researchers that we talked about in that NARA statement, those people that would be interested in those records 5, 10, 15, 20, 30 years from now, that are doing research on those records. A detailed folder list is very important for that type of research. Okay, legitimate reasons to permanently withdraw permanent records. There are legitimate reasons. Okay, and here are a few. A case or issue has been reopened, and the agency will be adding new records to the file. We'll be adding new records to the file. A lawsuit has been filed, and the agency needs the files to proceed. So they need new records will be added to that as well. And the agency and these P records are being audited. Okay, sometimes I'll refer to permanent records as P records just for the sake of moving faster. So don't be upset. The process could take months, and new records may be added to the files. Right, the records have been newly classified, where before they were not restricted. They will be sent back to the FRC as new transfers once reviewed and reclassified. And finally, better prepare for the transfer to the National Archives. So really what we're saying here is to better prepare for transfer to the National Archives, such as pulling the records back for refoldering, taking out non-records, personal papers, or working papers that are not considered permanent. Also looking for classified records that may not belong in this transfer, or identify the ones that are, and properly notifying NARA in your transfer that they are classified records. So that might be a legitimate reason for permanently withdrawing permanent records. It doesn't mean that you're permanently withdrawing them never to return to the archives, right, as a direct offer, or possibly at a sooner period if your schedule allows to return it to the Federal Records Center. But you may want to pull the records back to take care of these issues. Okay, those are some legitimate reasons. Now for the wrong reasons. So doing a permanent withdrawal of permanent records for the wrong reasons. And you can follow along on in your slides, and I've also have some notes in the notes section of the slides too that kind of expands a little bit more on this. So that'll help you out if you want to read further on it. So an individual in your agency is retiring and believes these records represent his or her life's work and are thus his or her personal property. These are true life examples. I've run into people like this, colleagues that we've dealt with, individuals throughout NARA that we've conferred with have dealt with these type of examples. And I'm sure even you in your agency may have these type of examples, or even other ones that you can provide that you are keeping or doing a permanent withdrawal of permanent records for wrong reasons. One or more individuals in your agency doesn't think the public should have access to these records, though your record schedule says otherwise, and that is the law, the record schedule, not what somebody thinks they should be, not when somebody wants to bring those records back because they don't think anybody else should be looking at them. That's what the record schedule says. Okay, another one. Although you have no continuing business need for these records, someone believes that agency access to these records will be too difficult if they become the property of the National Archives. These records, another one, are the agency's own historical treasures. How many times have you heard that? These are historical treasures for the agency, and you should like to store them locally to display them or bring them out to show important visitors. I had one agency that liked to show their books out in the sun, because it had the one date that they were on that particular day. Well, the place shut down, and the book was still out there and displayed, and had been out there for 2 years sitting in the sun. So do you really need to have a book displaying the date that's maybe 150 years old? You want to think about preserving the history for your future generations. And that serves a much more important function than having the book out in the sun showing visitors the date in a logbook. Your agency prefers to donate these important permanent records to a university that has shown intense interest in them. So no, colleges shouldn't be holding on to government records. That would be a wrong reason to have a permanent withdrawal, because maybe a local college or a very popular college will be giving you a grant money to process these records, so therefore we're going to pull them from the record center. No, that doesn't belong to them. The records belong to the American people in the National Archives at that point. The agency is withdrawing these records permanently just because it can, and just because they want them. There's a record schedule, and a record schedule has to be adhered to. And if there are issues or there are problems, then work through your record officer and work through your appraisal archivist in NARA. If you have certain issues, if you feel that any of these examples that we've given are examples that we should adhere to as an agency, then if that's the case, then we have to work that through. Because the record schedule does say what it says, and that's really the law. So that would be the takeaway here for the wrong reasons. Right? What can possibly go wrong when permanent records are permanently withdrawn from the FRC? That's a loaded question, right? Damage, theft, all of these things could possibly happen, and we've seen them happen again. More real-life examples. The permanent records may be inadvertently damaged or destroyed while the agency, fire, flood, earthquake, contamination, deterioration of the records while in the care of the agency. Records may be stolen, particularly if they are historically valuable. Someone may destroy the records by accident. Someone may destroy the records to suppress information about an issue, right? The records may be left. I mean, that's happened. I mean, that's happened in if you remember Arthur Anderson years ago, that happened as well. The records may be left in an office or on a shelf and forgotten with the passage of time. I had one agency where I actually was there at the time when it was happening, where somebody had come to them and had a box of historical records from 1980, and I knew they were historical by the title of the records, and this individual went to the record officer that was there. It wasn't the record officer, I believe it was a records liaison officer within the agency in the field, and said, "Should we keep these?" And she said, yeah, I think we should. So in all likelihood, that was, or possibly, a permanent withdrawal of records, that they needed it in the agency for some function, and then maybe just was lying on the ground somewhere, maybe down in the basement, maybe in somebody's closet somewhere. But that's what happens when you lose track of permanently withdrawn records. And permanent records are extremely valuable, so anything can happen. So these are just a few examples, and possibly there's some examples that you may want to put that you've come up with in the chat box. Has anybody out there come up with any other examples of people withdrawing permanent records and them being at risk in your agency? Has any of this happened to you? Any examples of permanent records being at risk in your agency? Any agency, and sometimes you don't foresee it happening too. So when you withdraw those records and you figure that, well, nothing can happen to these records once we withdraw them, these permanent records, you never know what can happen. I'm sure down in New Orleans they didn't expect something like that to happen to them. and it did. And I'm sure the hurricane up here on the East Coast, I'm sure they didn't expect that to happen in New Jersey. Nobody expects a disaster until it actually occurs. So if you do withdraw those permanent records for any length of time, you are putting them at risk. And a more secure place to have them is obviously the National Archives. Okay, now, a mess of trouble. So someone's going to be in a mess of trouble. It's against federal law to prevent public access to permanent federal records. That's according to the Federal Records Act. So your agency's records schedule, a negotiated agreement with the National Archives, right, states when your agency's permanent records must go to the National Archives. So it must go to the Federal Records Center and must from there go to the National Archives. So NARA's Code of Federal Regulations, if you look at the second bullet point, requires that an agency's permanent records go to the National Archives for eventual public access. So we even have at the end of these slides, which I sent you, I added at the end the regulations according to 36 CFR Part 1235.12, Point 14 and point 16, and there's some really interesting things there. Don't want to get too heavy into it because it kind of bogs us down here, but it is important to understand that this is the law, and these regulations would really assist you in our topic today. So go through those final three slides at the end, which we will not be going over, and that would be the 36 CFR 1235, 12, 14, and 16. Okay, now moving on. NARA requires that your agency ask permission of NARA to keep permanent records longer than the retention stated in the record schedule. So you have to ask NARA's permission to keep those records longer. All right, that kind of, that helps you along. That's when you do that in your agency, if you don't ask for NARA's permission to do this, you're kind of out on your own, but at least if you inform NARA of what's happening, you kind of back yourself up there. And destruction, damage, or loss of permanent records, if that happens, requires a report to the Archivist of the United States. So this is a real mess of trouble we're getting in here. But this is not something to scare you. This is something to encourage you to retire your permanent records to the National Archives, and to be very, very careful when you make the decision to do a permanent withdrawal. That's why we say what we're saying, and that's why we say a mess of trouble. If an agency frequently permanently withdraws its permanent records, they may be investigated by NARA or its own Inspector General. And the National Archives may be unable to accession your permanent records if part of your FRC transfer has been permanently withdrawn and part remains in the FRC. Your agency will keep paying for the FRC storage until this situation is resolved. So some archives may not take your records if you have just say 100 records and you take out 25 cases as a permanent withdrawal and you're leaving the other 75 in there. The National Archives may not take that as an accession into the archive. So be careful of the records that you take out, and make sure that when you do a permanent withdrawal, it is actually for a good reason. And also, finally, loss of agency's history. Yeah, an important chunk of your agency's work will be lost to history if the permanent records don't get accessioned. Accessioned is another term for transfer, but it's an archival term, so accessioning would mean moving the records from the FRC into the archive. So if permanent records don't get accessioned by the National Archives for public access, there could be a loss of history for your agency. And again, we'll get to some of your questions at the end. We're not going to be too much longer, hopefully, here. This, again, is your responsibility. Here is another 36 CFR. If this one is 1232.16. This is different, Lori, than what I cited earlier. And this one deals with, in the case, basically what documentation must an agency create before it transfers records to a record storage facility. So 12 Part B here is the one I'm highlighting, and you can read this through whenever you get a chance. You have the slides. But the section that I really want to concentrate on is 12B, and I'm going to read it out here because I think it's kind of important. In the case of permanent and unscheduled records, provide copies of such documentation to NARA and advise NARA in writing of the new location whenever the records are moved to a new storage facility. For permanent records, the agency must transmit this documentation to the National Archives and Record Administration Office of Chief Records Officer, the AC, and it has the physical address right there. No later than 30 days after records are transferred to the agency's records center or commercial records storage facility. Basically, let us know when you take these records out of the records center. We want to know where they end up. And there's the address right there, and this is being, the CFR is being updated, so keep your eye out on possible updates of this, this CFR citing, so there may be an update to the location that you'll be sending that information. But the takeaway here is we want to know what happens to those permanent records, because a lot of times what we're citing before here that could potentially happen to those records does happen, and we're trying to prevent that from happening. So we're on slide 22 now, how to get permanently withdrawn permanent records back to the FRC or the National Archives, okay? Send the permanent records back to the FRC as a new transfer with a new SF-135. New date range for the records and new box lists, okay? So basically, new transfer to FRC equals a new SF-135. So that's what happens when you do a permanent withdrawal. Right? Then the new FRC transfer will get to the National Archives through NARA's annual move process. Right? The annual move process is moving the records from the FRC to the National Archives, and these particular records are due to move to the National Archives. So that's what an annual move does. Now, if the records are overdue to the National Archives, make a direct offer. Overdue meaning if your record schedule states that these records after 15 years should go to the National Archives, and you're looking at those records and you withdrew them from the Federal Record Center after 10 years and they've been sitting around for 5, 6, 7 years, and you look and those records now can move directly into the National Archives. That's what we call a direct offer. And to make a direct offer of the permanent records to the National Archives, if a portion of these records or closely related records were not permanently withdrawn, cite the relevant FRC transfer numbers to bring both groups of records together for archive accessioning. So that would be into ERA. So you need to make a TR transfer request in ERA. So that's how the two ways that you can get permanent records back into the FRC or the National Archives after you've done a permanent withdrawal. So be careful, like I keep saying, be careful what you want, if you want a permanent withdrawal or a temporary withdrawal. Because permanent withdrawal requires, if you want to bring them back into the Federal Record Center, it would require a new SF-135. Okay, so this is kind of a graph depicting this, and that's on 23. That's my flow chart again. It keeps evolving, my flow chart. And now it's going from here, permanent withdrawals go back to the agency. From there, they should either go as a new transfer back to the FRC or as a direct offer to the agency, from the agency to the National Archives. And that's according to your record control schedule. So this is a graph version of what I kind of just said. So we're wrapping up here, almost to the end, everybody, and I know I've been keeping you for a while. How to avoid complications and risks of permanently withdrawing permanent records from an FRC. Okay? So here you say, will a temporary withdrawal meet your needs? You can add related records if they are within the original transfer date range from the same record series and are listed by you on an updated folder list. Then send the box or boxes to the FRC without doing a new FRC transfer. Call the FRC's attention to the revised folder list when you send the records back to the FRC. Okay, you can review records for privacy, security, and other reasons and send the box or boxes back to the FRC for refiling. And you can copy, scan, or otherwise use the records to support litigation or FOIA requests, then return the boxes to the FRC for refiling. If you added material, see the first bullet point above. So, to avoid the risk of permanently withdrawing records, you can do temporary withdrawals. They may meet your needs. If you're going to add to the temporary withdrawal of records, if you're going to add a box or two, just say, then it automatically will become a permanent withdrawal. And you'll have to fill out a new standard form 135 generally. Okay. Now, that being said, sometimes federal record centers do things differently. Okay. One federal record center may have a hard line at a certain rule, another one may allow certain things. So, this being said, with this presentation today, talk to your federal record centers. Okay. They're great people that have a lot of great advice. So, ask them how you should go about it. But this typically is the way to do it. For most records, you could get away with doing a temporary withdrawal as opposed to a permanent withdrawal. Permanent withdrawal automatically says that you have to fill out a new SF-135, right, generally, especially if it's been a period of time that the records have been withdrawn. A temporary withdrawal may be in your best interest, and that may be the case here. Okay?
We hope that you found this briefing to be useful and informative. For more information about the National Archives and Records Administration and our national training program, please visit us at www.archives.gov/recordsmanagement.